Story 1. I was standing in a long line at my CVS in Virginia. The woman behind me remarked on how crowded the store was, and we started talking. She had moved to Virginia from Tennessee. I said, "Oh, no kidding, me too. I came from Tennessee last year." "What town?" "The same town I came from." "What neighborhood?" "Same neighborhood." "What street?" "Same street." I said my address was 3384. She replied, "That was my house." She had sold it years before to the family we bought it from. Story 2. One time, my mom and I booked separate holidays. She with her friend and I with mine. It's worth mentioning that neither of us knew we were looking to book a holiday. We ended up on the same flight to the same country, took the same transfer, and our hotels were just 5 minutes apart. Oh, and we both got a bargain. Story 3. My friend once had a colleague give her a 25-year-old photo with an inscription on the back stating the names and ages of the children depicted. The colleague asked her, "Is this you and your sister?" When she confirmed it was, the colleague explained that she had found it inside a book she purchased from a secondhand store. Apparently, my friend's mother had been using the photo as a bookmark many years ago. She had lost the book on an interstate bus trip. We have no idea where it was in the intervening 25 years. Story 4. A not-so-happy story with a good ending. When I was 19, my boyfriend of a year slapped me across the face, leaving me shaken and confused. I called for a taxi to take me back to my mother's house, the home I had left because of her abusive husband. My boyfriend tried to stop me from leaving, causing a scene as I hopped into the taxi, which led the driver to ask what it was all about. I explained that my boyfriend and I were deeply in love, but he was very jealous and didn't trust me, which ultimately led to his violence that evening. The taxi driver became serious and insisted that I had to leave the relationship. At that point, we had just arrived at my mother's house, and I will never forget the look he gave me as he turned around and said, "I have driven your mother home here before. We live in a big city, so this was quite a coincidence." My mother rarely takes taxis, and I knew it must have happened once when she was out with her abusive husband, who had turned nasty, leaving her with no other way to get home. It made me realize I had fallen into the same pattern of relationship that my mother was in, which awakened me and gave me the courage and strength to end it. Eventually, my mother also left her husband. Many years later, she and I are both in happy relationships with much kinder men, and the cycle is thankfully broken. Story 5. I once sat next to a stranger on a plane who turned out to be my old neighbor from childhood. I recognized him because he had the same distinct laugh he had as a kid. Story 6. Back in the summer of 2010, I lived in a tent in the backyard of an amazing lady named Gretchen. She had a trampoline, an apple tree, ripe tomatoes growing on vines, and fresh blackberries right off the bush. A long line of lavender shrubs lined the driveway. It was the best summer of my youth. This was in northern Washington state, near the Canadian border. I moved away that winter and we fell out of touch. 4 or 5 years later, I had moved and traveled extensively. I ended up meeting my significant other and was living in Central Florida, over 3,000 miles away. I was working at a coffee shop when a woman came in while I was mopping. I did a double take because she looked so similar to Gretchen. I heard her give her name, and it wasn't my old friend. After a moment, though, I couldn't get over how uncanny it was. So I blurted out, "I'm sorry, but you look just like an old friend of mine." Her name was Gretchen, and she lived in Washington. The lady blinked at me and said, "Well, I have a sister named Gretchen who lives in Washington." It was unbelievable. She called her sister, and it was my old buddy. We hadn't spoken in years, but a few months later, Gretchen flew out to visit her sister, who was living not too far away from me, and they both came around for a visit. That was one of the 3 greatest coincidences of my life. Story 7. Months before my now wife of 23 years and I started dating, I bought a concert ticket with a group of friends for a show coming to my hometown. About 2 weeks before the show, my wife and I met and began dating. She decided to go to the show as well and purchased an extra ticket from a friend, someone I didn't know at all. We gathered for a while before the show, and by the time we entered the venue, we were feeling pretty good. We never once looked at our tickets, not even when we showed them to get in. Once we got in and wandered around for a bit, we decided to find the spot of whoever had the best seat. We pulled out our tickets to see where to head, and we had seats right next to each other. We've never looked back. Story 8. Back in 2001, our school went on a class trip to Washington, D.C. We were between tour times, and 4 or 5 of us were looping around the mall past the Capitol building. This was back when you could simply be there because nothing had happened yet, but I digress. Anyway, I saw a man near the reflecting pool with some people in suits following him. He was in a wheelchair. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. Suddenly, the wheelchair unfolded, and he stood up on 2 wheels. This was Dean Kamen, the inventor and founder of the first robotics competition. A couple of us in our group had founded a robotics team 2 years before to compete in that competition. We wandered over, introduced ourselves, thanked him, and mentioned that we were big fans, asking for his autograph. Nerd stuff. Fast forward to years later. I was long graduated and volunteering for the program. I ran into him at one of the regional competition events where he was visiting, and I offhandedly mentioned that we met him in DC that one time. He looked at me and said, "That was you." It turns out we accidentally disrupted his day a little. Not that he held it against us. The people in suits were interviewing him for a news segment, and we sort of broke the flow. They completely convinced themselves that we were plants that Dean had arranged to show up, and he had a huge ego problem. It apparently changed the tone of the rest of the day. Worth it, though. Story 9. After my mother died, I couldn't bear parting with her sewing machine, even though mine was better. I had tried to convince her for years to upgrade, but she always put it off. She was only 63 when she passed. After about 5 years, I thought it was time to let it go. But I wanted to give it to someone who needed it. I posted it online, and the first reply came from a woman who had the same machine and loved it, but hers had stopped working long before. I was happy to give it to her, but she lived about 3 hours away. Oddly, my father was going to the area with his new wife, who is lovely even if she's not my mother, to visit her mother, and he said he'd take it. He dropped the machine off and all was well. A few months later, he called me and was just beside himself. His wife's mother had entered hospice, and when the nurse caring for her entered the room, they were all stunned to see that it was the sewing machine recipient. They all got a little emotional. My mother was also a nurse, and I like to think she set it up. Story 10. I was waiting at the airport for our flight to Orlando. 3 other colleagues from work showed up with their spouses, and we were all on the same flight. I did not want to get on the plane because that is the kind of news that media outlets love to discuss when planes go down. Story 11. I live in Chicago. I was attending a festival in New York. On the last day of the festival, I was walking with a newly made friend in single file down a narrow pathway in the middle of the forest. She asked me where I lived in Chicago. Someone was walking towards us on the path, dragging a cooler on wheels. Because the path was so narrow, we turned to face each other and sidestepped to get past. As I was face to face with this person, I answered my friend, telling her the cross streets closest to where I live in Chicago. The person dragging the cooler stopped and asked, in what city? I replied, Chicago, and the stranger said, I live on in Chicago. And that's how I met my next door neighbor. Story 12. My best friend and I met women separately around the same time and started dating them. We decided to get together for a double date, and the 2 women were also best friends who worked together. None of us knew. We both got married, but the 2 women had a falling out, and we don't see each other much anymore. It was a few really fun years, though. Story 13. In the late 1980s, my dad went to see the ska band The English Beat. He was in the front row, and at the end of the concert, the lead singer leaned down from the stage and told him he liked his hair. In 2009, I went to see The English Beat, and at the end of the concert, the lead singer leaned down from the stage and told me he liked my hair. Is this a strange coincidence or something this guy does at every show? Story 14. I have one more story. I was working for a cleaning company and drove an hour out of town for a first-time clean. We were given a binder with the address, layout of the home, information about pets, who would be present and special notes about each room. On my first visit, I pulled into 555 Fair Avenue. I unloaded my things, approached the side door, and rang the doorbell. The note indicated that their adult son would be home, but if he didn't answer, the door was unlocked, and I could enter. There were notes about a friendly dog named Sunny. Specific instructions said to start in the art room, with the piano to the left of the kitchen. Sunny came out to greet me. I found the room with the exact description and began cleaning. 2 minutes in, a young man said, "Hello, can I help you?" Turned out I was in the wrong house. The dog was named Sunny, and everything else matched, but the actual house was on the next street to my right, on Fair Crescent. Story 15. I grew up and attended summer camp in northern Minnesota. In my 40s, I moved to Australia. My wife and I were vacationing in New Zealand and decided to rent a car and drive into a remote area, stopping along the way to take photos of the scenery. We pulled into a lookout that was just large enough for 4 or 5 cars. We hadn't seen a vehicle in the last hour, but as we were getting out, another car arrived. The driver was wearing a shirt with the name of my old summer camp on it. I struck up a conversation, and it turns out he attended the same camp but was a few years younger than me, so we didn't really know each other. We started naming people who were a couple of years younger than me, who were a couple of years older than him, and one of the people we both remembered was the typical extroverted class clown. As we were laughing at some of that kid's antics, another car pulled up, and a third couple joined us at the lookout. The guy overheard us mention the name of the camp clown and said, "That's my name, and I used to go there," pointing at the shirt. It was him, from a small summer camp in Minnesota. 3 people on the other side of the planet happened to all stop at the same place at the same time in the middle of absolutely nowhere. If it happened in a movie, I would never believe it. Story 16. We are considering getting a second dog, something in the 35-pound range. We already have a large chocolate Labrador, and she needs a playmate. She loves smaller dogs. One day, the Labrador was in the backyard barking intensely, which she usually doesn't do. When I went outside, I saw a very skinny terrier mix against the sound wall. She is doing much better now and has reached about 42 pounds. Story 17. Oh, I've had a couple of those. Once, I was taking a flight back from Madrid to my country. I was sitting close to my gate when someone sat next to me, waiting for the same flight. I didn't recognize him at first, but once on the plane, I realized he was in the seat next to mine. I noticed him staring at me as if to say, "I think I know who you are." Sure enough, it was a childhood friend I hadn't seen in 12 years who had moved to another state when we were kids. I didn't even remember he existed. Number 2. I lived in Canada for a year during high school. I met a lot of people, including a girl named Mary. We became friends and hung out, but that was it. After returning home, we didn't exchange numbers or contact information. 9 years later, while living in New York, I went with a couple of friends to watch a baseball game. We took the subway. The first car was packed, so we let it go and waited for the next one. When it arrived, the doors opened right in front of me with Mary standing there. We had not been in contact, and it turned out she was living there too. That was strange. Another example. I usually take several flights a year, flying from my city to another hub, and then to my final destination. I have come across the same friend at least 5 times at the hub airport. I never inform him of my travel plans, and we don't talk much, yet he is always there. It's quite odd. We don't even live in the same city, and we're never headed to the same place. There's more. Sometimes, I think something strange is going on. Story 18. When managing a hotel, a couple from Tennessee came through. As I checked them in, they told me they were driving across Canada. The man looked at my name tag and said, "Is Menacing Gummy a popular last name in Canada?" I replied that it wasn't at all, and it was fairly uncommon, in fact. He looked confused and told me that a few days before, they had visited a tourist information booth 3 provinces over, and the lady who helped them had the same last name as me. Knowing that this would only reinforce the stereotype that many Americans have about all Canadians knowing the guy named Steve they met on vacation once, I had to explain that the woman was my aunt. Story 19. When I was 17, on a whim, I went camping about 150 miles from home in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of friends. My parents basically said to call them at this time every day I was gone so they could hear from me. The only phone was 17 miles from the campsite, and on the second night there, I forgot until about 20 minutes before I was supposed to call. I got into my dad's Blazer and raced down the mountain to reach the only payphone within 50 miles. I pulled up, and there was this woman talking on the phone, going on and on about nothing while I was sweating bullets. I kept getting angrier and angrier. Nearly 45 minutes later, she finally hung up, and as she was walking away, I made a nasty comment to her. She flipped me off, gave me a hearty insult, and I didn't see her again. 2 years later, I was at university, a good 4-hour drive from where my parents lived and everywhere else I had been. One of my best friends that winter had a new girlfriend. She and I hit it off immediately. We were instant best friends. I met her for coffee one morning, and we were laughing about something. I finally said, "You know, I have this nagging feeling I know you from somewhere." She said the same thing, and it had been bothering her too, so we started exchanging notes. We realized it at the same time. I said, "You were the woman on the phone." And she replied, "You were that guy in the blue Chevy." We had a good laugh about it. She said, "You ruined my whole night with that." I went back home, had a bunch of beers, and complained about you to anyone who would listen. Story 20. I work as a medical examiner and was collaborating with a new employee who was doing part-time work at a local funeral home. She noticed my last name for the first time and said, "Oh wow, we just got a guy at the funeral home with that last name. It is not a common name." So I asked, "What's the first name?" Turned out to be my dad's name, even with the same initial for the middle name. For about 10 minutes, I thought my dad had passed away. Story 21. I am adopted and grew up without knowing any of my biological family or anything about them. I loved animals as a child, which developed into a fascination with parrots as I became a young adult. I learned everything I possibly could and had a pair of cockatoos, becoming known as the crazy bird lady in my friend's circle. I always thought it was just a coincidence that I liked parrots so much. When I was 22, I had the opportunity to meet my biological grandfather on my biological mother's side. It turned out he was the town's resident parrot expert while my biological mother was growing up. He had a pair of cockatoos he adored, along with a few other birds. I was amazed to discover that despite knowing nothing about these people and growing up far from them with completely unrelated influences, I shared such a strong interest with him in something that initially seemed random. Story 22. My brother and sister-in-law ran into our childhood neighbors at an airport in Iceland. We are from the United States. Interestingly, neither of them was visiting Iceland. They both had connecting flights from other places in Europe. Story 23. I am a bus driver. Part of my route takes me through a mall. One day, while on a 2-lane road that was about to merge, a car tried to beat me to it and sideswiped me. The driver blamed me, but he was held at fault. A year later, I was hit again by someone making a right turn from the left lane. Not only did it happen at the same spot as the previous accident, but one of the police officers who showed up was the same one who came to the first incident. Story 24. My wife and I were in line to enter the Arc de Triomphe in Paris when the people behind us recognized my dad. We are from California, and I noticed the guidebook they were reading had Marin County Library printed on the side. My dad had worked in Novato for years, even though we live 90 minutes away. We started talking, and it turned out they actually worked for the same company as my dad and knew him. Story 25. I live in Pennsylvania and have visited Washington, D.C. 5 times in my life. Each time, I have encountered someone I knew on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It has become a family joke. Story 26. I was at a really low point. Loneliness was weighing heavily on me. I missed my brother who had passed away some time ago. I asked the universe, if it was really listening, to show me some kindness in reflection of how I was feeling. A few minutes later, a stranger approached me and inquired about my brother, as I resembled him. Accustomed to sharing the story of my brother's passing, I told it once again and received a warm hug from this passerby. I realized then that the world is a strange place. Story 27. An hour before our school's open house last year, someone knocked on my classroom door. Usually, I would not answer because I guard my time. That night, I decided to open it and found a man I didn't know. He introduced himself as the father of one of my new students, and he wanted to stop by to see if he could catch me since he couldn't meet during the official hours. After speaking with him for a few minutes, I noticed the college name on his shirt. A very small college 4 hours away that I attended over 30 years ago. I mentioned it, and he said he attended there as well. It turned out we were there the same 2 years, lived at opposite ends of the same dorm, and worked at the same hotel. Story 28. I went to see the Rolling Stones at a huge stadium in the 1990s. We were in a great state of mind and arrived just as they started with "Start Me Up." We moved forward, and no one ever checked our tickets. We went down to the floor level and still no one looked at our tickets, including us, as we had no idea where our seats were. We finally got within about 12 rows of the very front of the stage, saw 2 open seats, and took them. No one ever checked our tickets. About halfway through the concert, we decided to see where our real seats were. We showed an usher, and he took us back to the same seats. We found our seats at a 40,000-seat venue by luck. Story 29. A few years ago, I retired as a South Bronx elementary school teacher after a 32-year career. In the early 2000s, my girlfriend and I took a trip to the Galapagos Islands. When we landed on the island, I heard my name being called out. It was one of my least favorite students from about 10 years prior. Literally, at the far end of nowhere, I ran into a former student. 6 years ago, I was called for jury duty, and I had to tell the judge that I could not serve on a particular case because the defendant was the brother of the student I met in the Galapagos. Story 30. I dropped out of college halfway through my freshman year and ended up in an abusive relationship. We rented a small motel room month to month, and I worked at a local business answering phones. Years later, when I met my birth mother, she told me how she had dropped out of college before getting pregnant with me. While she was pregnant, she and my birth father rented the same room at the motel, and she answered phones at the same place as I did. Our lives lined up exactly at those ages. This always amazed me. Story 31. Not really so remarkable, but it still left me shaken. A few years ago, I had an early morning dream about a friend and former colleague that I hadn't seen or spoken to in 7 or 8 years. That very same day, he called me unexpectedly to check in and catch up. Story 32. I bought my daughter a toy called 100 Words. She actually has several of them. The first one I bought her randomly broke one day. My godsister called me to say she wanted to send her a gift. I didn't ask what it was. A few days later, it arrived, and it was the same 100 Words toy that had broken just days earlier. No one knew the toy was broken because I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Story 33. My husband and father both had work trips to the same major city and ended up booking hotel rooms at the same hotel. They ran into each other in the hallway. Story 34. Flying from Australia to the United States, I sat next to a man who was going on a 2-week trip while I was moving there. 5 months later, I booked a flight to return home. Guess who was sitting next to me? The same man. It turns out he had gone home, saved for a few months, and then returned to the United States for another holiday. Story 35. Backstory. My wife and I run an online Bible study linked to a church in New York City, but we live in France. Of course, none of the Americans really comprehend where we are in France, just as where they are in New York does not mean much to us since we have not been there. A lady from that group who had not been able to join for a few months was in Paris on business. She had a day off, saw an advertisement for a major attraction in the metro, and decided to visit. She took a high-speed train and got off at the nearest stop, assuming she could get a ride-sharing service. Newsflash. When you are in a small market town in the middle of nowhere, even by French countryside standards, there are no ride-sharing services available. Realizing there was no way she could get there and back in time for her return train, she decided to join the Bible study from a cafe. She did not mention she was in France because she was feeling a bit silly. At some point, we heard Bon Appetit in the background and asked where she was. Turned out she was less than 10 minutes from our house. We were able to spend an afternoon with her, and she got to meet my mother-in-law just before she passed away. I should also add that this sort of disorganization is highly out of character for her. She is a successful businesswoman and chief financial officer of a large restaurant chain. Everything about that day was unexpected. Story 36. Back in 2021, I had been urging my partner to let me get a kitten. For months, I sent him postings on local shelter and rescue websites featuring adorable kittens. Then, on my birthday, while we were enjoying food from the Cheesecake Factory, I received a flurry of messages and a phone call from our roommate at the time. She and her mother had found a kitten in her mother's backyard. Our roommate's partner, who also lived with us, said no to keeping the kitten. She estimated it was about 4 to 5 weeks old, too young to be away from its mother. I looked at my partner and suggested that we could foster the kitten until it was old enough to be rehomed. Now, that kitten is going to be 4 years old in August, and he is my son. We joked that I manifested him too hard. 2 days later, my roommate's mother found another kitten that we assumed was my kitten's sibling. Ultimately, my roommate ended up with a kitten after all. Story 37. Several times I have had dreams that seem normal. The only difference is that something would happen in the dream that typically would not occur in real life, although these events are not statistically unlikely. It is just that there is no reason for them to actually happen. There was always this feeling that it was not just a dream. For example, I had a dream that I was at work and my ex-partner came in. I had not thought about her in a long time and had not seen her in years. When we were together, she never liked that place. Sure enough, less than a week later, she came in. I had never seen her there before or after that. Story 38. I believed in karma since I was a kid, but one day I felt low and started questioning whether karma was real. I parked my car to go to college and silently asked the universe to show me a sign if karma truly existed. 5 minutes later, I saw a large graffiti on a wall with the word karma written in bold letters. Story 39. A few years ago, my daughter had a 2003 bright orange Volkswagen Beetle with a sunroof and eyelash headlights. My new partner had the exact same car, but not at the same time. Story 40. I occasionally get small calcium buildup spots on my skin. They are very small, white, pimple-like spots that appear on the edges of my facial openings, barely noticeable and rare. However, I had one on the inner bottom eyelid, right where my tear duct is. I ignored it for a while and didn't mind it, but it grew large enough for me to notice and it became bothersome. I told my mom about it, and she said she would help me get rid of it using a sewing needle and a warm compress the next time I saw her. That night, as I was trying to sleep, my cat jumped on my bed and walked over my face. Her nail accidentally caught the tiny white spot in the corner of my eye and popped it. It didn't hurt at all. I had no scratch or scar. It was just gone. Story 41. Not me, but my relatives. In the 1950s, my great-uncle met a woman and they started dating. She was fiery, and he would hold his own when needed. They had been courting for months when they had a huge fight, a massive, blazing row over a small thing. They were so aggravated by each other that his date stormed out of his house, swearing never to speak to him again. It had been over a month when one day he thought, I really miss her. Maybe this wouldn't work, but he decided to go over to her house, apologize, and see if he could win her back. So he set out walking. At about the halfway point between their houses, he bumped into her and confessed how he was feeling, and so did she. She had chosen that exact moment to walk to his house, apologize, and try to restart things too. They must have been married for over 50 years when my great-aunt and uncle passed away peacefully within a year of each other. Story 42. My grandmother had cancer when I was in my final year of high school. Her prognosis was poor, and they expected her to die within a year. My school was close to her house, and during breaks, I would walk over to check on her since we were quite close. My life was challenging, and I was bordering on suicidal. In my desperation, I begged the universe not to take my grandmother away. I promised to work hard on my exams and do my best to stay alive if my grandmother would also survive. A few days later, we received news from the hospital. The scans showed her cancer was gone. Possibly the chemotherapy or radiation worked, or the severity had been initially overestimated by the doctors. Everyone was astonished by this result. Felt like a miracle and seemed impossible. She lived for another couple of years and then her cancer returned, but by then, I felt strong enough to let her go. That was my small miracle, and selfish though it was, I didn't believe I could live without her. I asked for this all for myself, but I will be forever grateful. Story 43. I was in Ontario to visit my hometown. I had been living in British Columbia. I ran into a friend I met in British Columbia at Toronto Airport while returning, not knowing they had also gone back to their hometown in Ontario. This happened twice with two different friends, and one of them was even on my flight. Story 44. I moved to Buffalo. There is a nice lady across the street. I found out her daughter lived across the street from my mom in New Jersey. Story 45. I grew up with just my mom and my brother in the late 1980s. My mom, besides being a single mother, was also an immigrant and all alone in this country. Life was rough. After 14 years of raising two kids on her own, my mom finally saved enough money to buy a small duplex across town. It was her biggest dream. There was a tall man who walked his dog past our house every other day. I thought it was the ugliest dog I had ever seen. My mom's best friends had just started a job at a new factory 2 towns over. Their new manager looked just like my little brother. It turns out their new manager lived 2 blocks behind my mom, had an ugly dog, and was my father. In short, we unknowingly moved 2 blocks away from my dad and watched him walk his dog for a year before meeting him. Story 46. I was backpacking through China and picked up 3 travel companions. We crisscrossed the country together for a month before 2 of them had to return to Europe. The other person and I traveled together for another month before he went home. I took a photo of the 4 of us on a boat. I obtained all of their addresses and sent them postcards from various places but never heard from them again. More than 10 years later, I was in a restaurant with a friend when he received a video call from his sister, who lived in Europe in the same country as one of my travel companions. He stepped outside and spoke with her for about 10 minutes. When he returned, he told me his sister had just gotten engaged. He described her fiancé and mentioned his name. I jokingly asked, "Is his last name common name?" My friend confirmed it and asked how I knew. I explained about my travel companion from China and showed him the picture I took on the boat. It was indeed one of my travel companions. My friend sent it to his sister and surprised her. Story 47. I signed a lease for an apartment. Later, I went to work overnight. I picked up a newspaper in the break room before my shift started and read my horoscope, which said, "A change of residence is highlighted." Story 48. I went to watch Liverpool versus Manchester United in a preseason game in Charlotte, South Carolina. I was in a pub before the match when I heard someone say my name. It was a guy I went to school with in England. He moved to the United States when he was about 12, and I had not spoken to him since. We are now in our 40s. Anyway, it doesn't end there. I went to the match, found my seat, and guess who I was sitting next to in a stadium of 77,000 people? Story 49. I was outside walking in my yard, talking to a woman on the phone about picking up a barn cat to control our rodent population. While I was setting up a time to meet her, a scrawny tabby walked over to me from inside the chicken coop. It was the first time I had seen this cat, and he never left. He has been the best, and I feel lucky he chose me. Story 50. I was in the military station at Fort Sam Houston, a training post. The coincidence happened in 3 different ways. I was showing a friend photos from home. One was of a man named Tom Gagnon, a coworker who I later learned lived in my apartment complex. That was already surprising for me, since our workplace was in Phoenix, about 10 miles away from where we lived in Mesa, Arizona. But that coincidence was then, and this was now while I was flipping through the photos I brought from home. When I passed the one of him in the apartment swimming pool, I mentioned his name. She said, "Oh wow, I dated a guy named Gagnon for a couple of years back in Rhode Island. We were in Phoenix, but I knew he was from Rhode Island. So, of course, I had to ask her old boyfriend's name and call my friend to see if they were related. Indeed, they were. He was the father of her former boyfriend. The final stage of the coincidence, though, came a few years ago when I got my DNA tested and discovered that his surname appeared prominently in my DNA matches. I haven't located a direct link to someone with his first name, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happens. Story 51. When I was younger, I woke up late for work and quickly got dressed. As I stepped outside, one of yesterday's socks fell out of my trouser leg. I picked it up, put it in my pocket, and headed to work. At the time, I worked in a garage fixing cars, and in the afternoon, I had washed some cars we had finished with. My coworkers saw the puddles on the floor and started trying to push each other into them. In the scuffle, one of my shoes came off, and I saw an evil grin on my friend's face as he pushed me hard, causing me to step into the puddle with my shoeless foot. He thought it was hilarious until he saw me take off my wet sock and calmly replace it with a dry one from my pocket. Story 52. My sister and I attended the same college. During our senior year, a new dorm was under construction. On one of the steel beams, a couple of stories up, there was graffiti that read, "High A, High B." Story 53. I randomly encountered a girl I grew up with while visiting New York City. Although I only lived an hour outside the city during college, what are the chances of running into someone you know in a place with over 8 million people? That same day, I also ran into Molly Ringwald. Thus ends my random encounters in New York City. Story 54. A classmate I had never seen before or after sat beside me in class one day and apologized to the professor for missing the previous lesson because he was in my home state. I asked if he was from there, and he replied that he had only been there for a wedding and that the town was so small I'd probably never heard of it. It turned out to be my hometown and my cousin's wedding. Story 55. Not me, but my grandmothers grew up in the same neighborhood in Texas and never knew each other. My dad was a music student and went away to music school in Michigan. Then my parents actually met in college in North Carolina. Story 56. In the early 1980s, I was helping to set up my dad's bookstore and went to a nearby payphone to call my friend Jeff to see if he could give me a ride. I dialed what I thought was Jeff's number, and a guy answered. "Jeff?" I asked. "Yeah. Who is this?" He replied. "It's me, Steve. What's up? Could you come pick me up and give me a ride?" "Sure. Where are you?" I explained my location, and although he sounded confused about my dad having a bookstore, he said he would be over to get me. 10 minutes later, a complete stranger showed up asking if Steve was there. I had dialed the wrong number to a Jeff who happened to know a Steve and was a good enough friend to be willing to give him a ride. Story 57. I was stationed in Alaska and won a trip to Japan. I ran into a high school friend who was on rest and relaxation from Vietnam. He was coming out of the barrack showers as I was going in. I never saw him again. Story 58. I just had a baby on April 10th. She was 3 months early, and it has been very stressful. I was looking at my old journal entries, and on April 10th of last year, I miscarried my first pregnancy. What are the odds? Story 59. This is minor compared to all the great stories. In the 1970s, my friend and I were driving down a dirt road listening to music on the radio. Our car hit a dip, which is fairly common on dirt roads, but this one had recently been redone. Right when the car jerked and bounced from running over the dip, the song on the radio skipped as if the record player was in our car. We both looked at each other, and it took us a couple of seconds to figure it out before we started laughing about it. Story 60. I was walking to the shop to grab some snacks at around 2 or 3 a.m. It's a short journey that I've made countless times. The start of my walk involves heading down a hill to an open, well-lit T-junction. While walking down the hill, I can clearly see the entire area around the junction. The sparse and silent. No cars, no people, nothing. It's early in the morning, after all. I cannot stress enough how empty this area was. I take a left at the junction, which had been in my line of sight for the entirety of my walk down the hill, and hear a noise right behind me. Clip-clop. Galip-glop. I turn around and there's a huge, beautiful, solid black horse following closely behind me. I mean, it was massive. Followed me up the road, down the road, across the road. Everywhere I went, the horse shadowed me. Once I realized it wasn't going to stop following me, We walked to a safe place and I called the non-emergency line since I wasn't sure what else to do. The horse and I navigated through increasingly niche phone menus, hoping there would be an option for this predicament, until we reached a menu option that said, "Press 3 if there's an unexpected horse obstructing or threatening to obstruct a main roadway." Ha! Yes, please. I pressed 3 and was connected to a phone operator who, when confronted with this situation, clearly thought I was wasting her time and said they obviously wouldn't have anyone trained to handle that. "It's in your convoluted phone menu." Without help from the authorities, I decided to walk the horse to a safer place away from the road. We walked for about 15 minutes to a small patch of grass that technically counts as a park, which was on the way to the shop anyway. The horse seemed content there and stopped following me. So I popped into the shop, bought some snacks, and when I came out, the horse had disappeared entirely. I looked for it but couldn't find it anywhere. I ended up going home without my companion. Again, I live in a city. There are no horses or horse-friendly areas for miles. I have no idea where the horse came from, how I failed to notice its enormous presence, or how I failed to hear it clip-clopping until it was breathing in my ear, all in this remarkably well-lit and completely silent intersection. I wasn't on my phone or listening to music. The world works in mysterious ways. I hope the horse is okay. Story 61. I bumped into an old friend while visiting the Lincoln Memorial. We both lived in different states at the time, 1,000 miles away from Washington, D.C. We were on a family vacation about 2 hours from home when my dad's luggage fell out of the back of his truck. The person who found it lying in the middle of the street was our former next-door neighbor, whom we hadn't seen in years. She recognized the name on the tag and called us right away. I was in a different vehicle and had to call my dad and tell him to pull over. Story 62. I met my childhood crush here on Reddit through a Reddit for Reddit post. She was my first kiss in 4th grade and only spent a year at our school before leaving. We had no idea who we were until the day we were supposed to meet when we video called, and she said her name. She mentioned she picked my response because most of the other men were inappropriate and she was bored. It turns out we live less than 3 miles from each other and have lived close to one another for nearly 15 years. Story 63. I once got 3 bullseyes in a row in darts. Of course, my friends were in the next room and never believed me. Story 64. I bought a dress on Vint and had a short chat with the seller about sizing beforehand. It was a quick exchange, but she seemed really nice, and we both gave each other 5 stars. I ordered the dress and thought nothing of it until it arrived in a package with a photograph of my house from the 1950s. It turned out her family lived there for decades before me. It was such a strange but very sweet coincidence. And I think we were both pleased to have liked each other before we knew. Story 65. I was flying across the Atlantic solo for the first time to visit my grandmother after graduating high school. I had chosen a small, lesser-known college and was suddenly doubting my decision not to attend a more prestigious school that had accepted me. Planes can make me feel melancholic, so I really started reflecting on my poor life choice. The elderly lady next to me struck up a conversation, and I shared my life story. She was hard of hearing, so I had to speak up. No sooner did I finish than a passenger a row up on the aisle turned around and said, "I'm sorry, I couldn't help overhearing you. I just graduated from that college. You're going to love it there. Actually, my best friend's brother is starting there this fall too. He's a cool guy. You should connect with him." My whole outlook changed. The friend's brother and I became good friends. I stayed all 4 years instead of transferring as I had planned. As if that's not enough, fast forward 6 years and I was at a kindergarten where I met a woman my wife, her colleague, was always telling stories about. As soon as I heard her voice, I knew she was the one who gave me the college pep talk on the plane. It was truly cool to be able to share my side of the story and thank her for changing my whole perspective in that random encounter halfway across the Atlantic. Story 66. Not really a story, but some odd coincidences between my husband and me. My favorite number has always been 19, which is also his hockey jersey number from his playing days. His name is Mike, and my dad's name is also Mike. My sister-in-law's first name is a short version of one of my sister's names, and her middle name is my first name. We both have scars on the same spot on our chins from completely different injuries. My mother's first name is my mother-in-law's middle name. We grew up 15 minutes from each other but never met until after we had completed college and were working in or near a big city. Story 67. Another experience was when a few families, including mine, hosted exchange students from Europe. We live in City M. There were also exchange students staying in City T, 1,500 miles away. Someone organized a trip to City D to visit a tourist attraction, so we all went. While we were going about our day in City D, we heard someone calling one of the exchange students' names. It turned out to be his brother, who was staying in City T. The host family flew to visit their family in City D and took the student to the tourist attraction. I don't know the chances of two brothers, each staying 1,500 miles apart, having host families who decided to visit the same attraction in a city neither of them lives in, but they must be pretty low. Story 68. Went to a work function with my husband in another state. We were living in Virginia at the time, and the entire Virginia team was taking a trip to New York City. He introduced me to his colleague who worked out of Richmond, Virginia, and was wearing a sweater from the college in my hometown. I mentioned that's where I was from, and he responded, "Me too, whereabouts?" I told him the suburb, and he said, "Oh, my aunt lives there, on a road called John Huss." I replied, "That's the road I lived on. Who's your aunt?" It turned out I lived across the street from his aunt, and his cousin used to babysit me. He called her right then at around 10 at night and asked her about me. She said, "Oh yeah, that's my mom's name, daughter." Story 69. I thought of another story. I live in Los Angeles and did some modeling for an independent magazine. The photographer and I were talking when he asked me where I was from. I'm from a small town in the South, and I told him. He was from Washington, D.C. He said, "Hey, my ex-girlfriend is from a small town in the South too. I bet you know her." I did know her. She was my cousin. Story 70. Without knowing or planning it, a friend of mine and I ended up being neighbors 3 separate times across multiple state lines. After college, my wife and I moved to a state neither of us was from. I play games online with my friends frequently. A few months later, I asked a friend where he was living since he had also moved 500 miles from home. We were living on the same street, just a few houses apart. Years later, he got a really good job in another state, so he moved. I know which state, but I don't remember his city or address. We still play online. A couple of years later, I also moved to a new state after finding better work, the same state as my friend. After settling in and getting online to play, the friend asked which city I chose, and I gave him my new address. "Bro, I can see your house from my window." This exact exchange happened a third time about a year later. We both moved to new cities again separately without mentioning it. We were 1 street apart in the same neighborhood. We have since moved apart, but I'm just waiting for it to coincide again. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.